The wind over the high desert of eastern Afghanistan was a living thing, a constant moaning presence that carried dust and the thin, dry smell of altitude. For the 13 men lying prone on the rocky ridgeline, it was the enemy's most reliable ally. They were the best marksmen their respective units could offer, hand-picked for a single, seemingly impossible task: a surgical strike from 4,000 meters. The target was a high-value militant leader, a shadow known only as the Director, who was meeting with his senior lieutenants in a fortified compound carved into the face of a mountain on the valley floor below. The distance was legendary, a shot that pushed the very limits of physics and human capability. At 4,000 meters, a bullet fired from a .50 caliber rifle would take nearly 6 seconds to reach its target. In that time, the Earth's rotation would subtly alter its path. The air density, temperature, and that relentless wind would twist and bucket like a wild animal. It wasn't just a shot, it was a calculus problem written in the language of ballistics, solved in the space between heartbeats. For 3 days, the 13 snipers had been in position, their hides camouflaged so perfectly they were invisible a few feet away. They were legends in their own right, champions from sniper school competitions, record holders, men with kill counts in the dozens. Each had taken his turn at the scope of the massive M82A1, a rifle more like a piece of artillery than a personal weapon. Each had run the numbers through their Kestrel handheld weather meters, factored in the Coriolis effect, the spin drift, the uphill angle of the shot. The first sniper, a Texas Ranger with a calm, methodical drawl, had exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a thunderclap that echoed off the surrounding peaks, a sound of pure violence. The men watched through their high-powered spotting scopes as the bullet traced a path through the thin air, a tiny, distorted speck against the vastness of the valley. It landed harmlessly in the scree slope 100 meters short and to the left of the compound. A puff of dust. A miss. A Navy sniper, a precise man from the Midwest, was next. He'd spent hours calculating, adjusting for every conceivable variable. His shot was closer, striking a rock wall just below the target's position, sending a shower of fragments into the air. The men in the compound barely flinched, their own security oblivious to the fact that death had just whispered past them. One by one, the 13 titans of the long gun took their shot. Each round was a tiny, high-velocity meteor, and each one failed to find its mark. One came within inches, the bullet's shockwave kicking dust onto the director's robes as he walked across a rooftop. He paused, looked around, and then continued inside, unharmed. The frustration on the ridgeline was a palpable thing, a bitter taste of failure that mixed with the grit of the dust in their mouths. They had the angle, they had the technology, they had the skill, but the distance was a fortress in itself. Back at the Tactical Operations Center, miles away in a fortified base, the situation was grim. The mission was on the verge of being scrubbed. An airstrike was considered, but the risk of civilian casualties in the nearby village was too high, and the intel suggested the meeting would be over within hours. The director would vanish back into the shadows, and the opportunity would be lost, perhaps forever. The atmosphere in the TOC was thick with tension. Rows of screens displayed drone footage of the compound and the static, desperate figures of the snipers on the ridge. A colonel stared at the feed, his jaw tight. "Get me someone who can make this shot," he said, his voice low and even but carrying the weight of command. "I don't care where they are or what they're doing. Find them!" That's when someone mentioned a name. Not a famous sniper, not a record holder. It was the name of a man who existed in the quiet spaces between the legends. He was a senior chief, a SEAL operator whose file was thick with operations no one would ever read about. His specialty wasn't just shooting, it was the seamless integration of violence and stealth. He was part of a squadron known for its quiet professionalism, and he was currently on a different assignment, prepping for a night raid in a nearby province. They called him Ghost. Ghost wasn't his call sign in the usual sense. It wasn't about being unseen, though he certainly was that. It was about the effect he had on a problem. He didn't announce his presence with bravado or noise. He simply appeared. The situation was resolved, and he was gone, leaving only the result behind. He was of average height, with a face that was more thoughtful than severe, and eyes that held a calm, deep-water stillness. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were measured and carried a weight that made people listen. Within an hour, a helicopter was cutting through the thin, cold air, ferrying Ghost and his gear towards the ridgeline. He was carrying his own rifle, a modified Mark 13 Mod 1 chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It wasn't the massive .50 caliber the others were using. It had less raw power at that extreme range, but it was a rifle he knew intimately, an extension of his own body. It was accurate, consistent, and predictable. While the others were trying to overpower the distance with sheer force, Ghost's philosophy was different. It was about precision, not power. It was about listening to the wind, not fighting it. The helicopter dropped him off at a lower elevation, and he made the final ascent to the sniper hide on foot, moving like a wisp of smoke through the boulder-strewn landscape. When he arrived, the 13 snipers looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled skepticism. This was the guy? The one they'd pulled from a direct action mission to do what they, the best in the business, couldn't. They saw a quiet man with a smaller rifle. They didn't see the thousands of hours of practice, the hundreds of missions, the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had been tested in ways they couldn't imagine. Ghost didn't introduce himself with a speech. He simply nodded to the SPOT team leader and moved to the edge of the hide. He didn't even look through his rifle's scope at first. He just lay there, prone, for a long time. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind on his skin, not as an adversary to be measured and countered, but as a force to be understood. He felt the way it swirled around the rocks, the way it gusted and ebbed in a rhythm that was both chaotic and predictable. He was building a mental model of the air between him and the target. The other snipers watched, some with impatience, others with a dawning sense of respect. This wasn't a man rushing to prove himself. This was a man communing with his environment. He finally opened his eyes and began his preparations. He didn't pull out a kestrel and start punching numbers. He checked his rifle, running his hands over the bolt, the stock, the scope with the familiarity of a lover. He then began to study the compound through his spotting scope, not just the target area, but the entire picture. He watched the way dust devils formed and dissipated on the valley floor. He watched the way a small bush below them was being bent by the wind, its movement a crude but effective anemometer. He finally spoke, his voice a low murmur directed at the spotter next to him. He'll be on the North Terrace in about 20 minutes. That's where the wind is most consistent. The spotter looked at him, puzzled. How do you know? I watched his pattern, Ghost said simply. He walks the perimeter every hour. He stops on the north side to look at the mountains. It's his moment of peace. The intel officer back in the TOC listening to the comms quick cross-referenced the drone footage. Ghost was right. The director had a habit, a tiny human routine he probably wasn't even aware of. In a world of shadows and paranoia, it was a sliver of light. The wait began. Ghost remained motionless, his breathing so shallow his chest barely seemed to move. He was no longer just a man on a ridge, he was a part of it. The 13 snipers, who had initially felt a pang of wounded pride, now found themselves holding their breath, drawn into the gravity of his focus. This was different. This wasn't about skill, this was about something deeper. It was about a profound, almost spiritual connection to the task. The minutes ticked by. The wind continued its relentless dance. Then, the door to the compound opened. The director emerged, flanked by 2 guards. He walked slowly, as Ghost had predicted, around the perimeter of the rooftop terrace. He stopped on the north side, facing the mountains. He stood there, a tiny figure 4,000 meters away, a man contemplating a view he had probably seen 1,000 times. He was, for a few seconds, completely still. In that instant, Ghost moved. It was a fluid, seamless transition from stillness to action. He settled behind his rifle, his body conforming to the stock. He took a deep, slow breath, letting half of it out. His world narrowed to the intersection of the crosshairs and a point on the director's chest. In his mind, he wasn't just seeing the target, he was seeing the path. He was feeling the wind's pressure on his cheek, translating it into a minute adjustment of his aim, an offset so small it was barely a tremor in the muscles of his hand. He was factoring in the bullet's drop, the spin, the Earth's rotation, not as numbers from a chart, but as an intuitive feel, a sixth sense honed by years of practice. He didn't think. He simply allowed the shot to happen. The crack of the Mark 13 was sharper, less thunderous than the .50 caliber. It was a clean, precise sound. For the other snipers, the next 5 seconds were an eternity. They watched through their scopes, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They saw the tiny speck of the bullet, invisible to the naked eye, arcing across the impossible gulf of space. It was a line drawn by God, straight and true. The director never moved. He was still facing the mountains when the high-grade, match-grade bullet, after a 4,000-meter journey that defied belief, found its mark with a finality that was absolute. He crumpled instantly, a silent fall that was witnessed by a handful of men on a ridge miles away. For a long moment, no one on the ridgeline moved. The silence after the shot was deeper than any they had ever known. It was filled with the echo of the impossible. Then, the spotter next to Ghost, a veteran with decades of service, lowered his scope and looked at the quiet man beside him. His eyes were wide with an awe he couldn't articulate. Ghost simply began to break down his rifle. His face showed no triumph, no emotion at all. It was the face of a craftsman who had just completed a difficult piece of work. He packed his gear, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and looked at the 13 men who were staring at him as if he were an apparition. "The wind was good," he said, his voice quiet and even. That was his only explanation. He then turned and began the long walk down the mountain, a solitary figure disappearing back into the landscape from which he'd come. He didn't wait for accolades, for the mission debrief, for the commendations that would inevitably follow. He had a different mission to get back to. He left behind 13 men who would never be the same. They were the best in the world, and they had just witnessed something that transcended their understanding of what was possible. They had seen the difference between being a great shooter and being an artist of war. They had seen that true mastery wasn't about ego or records or the size of your rifle. It was about a quiet, complete, and utterly selfless dedication to the craft. It was about becoming one with the wind, the distance, and the moment, until the shot wasn't something you took, but something that simply happened because you had removed every obstacle in its path. The legend of the 4,000-meter shot would be told and retold in special operations circles for years to come. But the men who were there that day never spoke of it as a feat of marksmanship. They spoke of it as a lesson in humility, a glimpse into a level of focus they had only ever heard about in myths. They had come to the mountain to prove they were the best, and they had left having learned what the best truly meant. They had learned that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who has mastered the loudest storms within himself, and that the most powerful weapon isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that, in the right hands, can deliver a whisper of death across an impossible distance.